I had just come home from the hospital, my chest still aching from heart surgery, but my heart more full of gratitude than fear. I thought I would open the door to warmth, the familiar sight of my life waiting for me, every photo and keepsake exactly as I left it. Instead, I froze in the doorway. The shelves were bare. The corners where boxes once sat stood empty. Something felt wrong. Even before anyone spoke, my son-in-law appeared with a satisfied grin. "We took care of all that old junk," he said proudly, as though doing me a favor. My daughter stood beside him, nodding. That single word, junk, made my throat tighten. I knew in that moment my recovery would not be the hardest battle I faced. This is just the beginning of my story of betrayal, value, and justice. Before I go on, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I love seeing the different places our community gathers from. I wish I could say I was only surprised by the empty rooms. But what I would discover later made that day unforgettable. So, let's get into what happened after that moment when my son-in-law announced that he had cleared out my so-called junk. I stood there with my hand still resting against the frame of the doorway, trying to steady myself, not from the weakness of the surgery but from the hollowness that filled my chest as I looked around. The walls looked bare in a way they never had before, even back when we first moved into this house decades ago. I could not immediately tell what was gone, only that the house did not feel like mine. My daughter walked ahead of me, pulling out a chair as if nothing had happened. She was cheerful, almost rehearsed in her calm tone, saying that this would be better for me. "Less dust, less clutter, more room for you to move around safely," she explained, as though she were talking to a fragile patient in recovery. I wanted to tell her I was still her mother, not some helpless case study, but the word stuck. My son-in-law added, "You'll thank us. We made it livable again." Livable. That word burned more than I could show. I glanced toward the hallway where the bookshelf used to stand, filled with albums, recipe binders, and even my husband's war medals. The shelf was gone. The hallway looked too open, too empty, like the air itself had been scrubbed of memory. I asked where the things had gone, though my voice came out softer than I intended. My son-in-law shrugged and said he hauled most of it to the curb for pickup. He spoke as if he had done something heroic, his arms crossed with satisfaction. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying his words in my head. Old junk. As though the afternoons I spent pressing flowers with my daughter when she was small, tucking them into books, were junk. As though the chest that carried my husband's handwritten letters from the army was junk. Even the quilts I made during lean winters, each stitch pulled with tired but determined hands, were now considered useless clutter. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was what growing older meant, watching your life's work be reduced to trash bags without your permission. The next morning, I forced myself to walk slowly through the house. My body still ached from the surgery, but it was my spirit that trembled most. Every room felt rearranged, sanitized, like a showroom instead of a home. My daughter made me tea and insisted this was a fresh start. She smiled brightly and said, "You'll feel lighter without all that stuff." I smiled back weakly, though inside I felt heavier than ever. I wandered into the living room and noticed the space where the old cedar chest used to sit. That chest was one of the first pieces of furniture my husband and I bought together. It held not valuables in the traditional sense, but priceless fragments of our story. I remembered opening it the night before my surgery, running my fingers across the faded photographs, the lace from my wedding veil, the medals tucked neatly in a velvet pouch. All gone now, discarded with the rest. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside for air, needing a moment alone. That was when I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Turner, walking across the street, holding a small wooden box. She looked uneasy, as though she wasn't sure if she should approach me. She explained gently that she had noticed some items piled by the curb and thought it was odd. She said the trash collectors hadn't come yet, so she took one box that seemed too personal to leave outside. She held it out carefully, saying, "I hope you don't mind. I thought it might be important." I felt a rush of gratitude mixed with shame as I reached for it. The box was old, scratched, and heavier than it looked. I recognized it instantly. It was the jewelry box my husband once gave me on our 10th anniversary. Inside were not diamonds or gold, but things far more personal. A locket with our wedding photo, a silver brooch that belonged to my grandmother, and folded envelopes tied with string. My breath caught as I held it. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the box open in front of me. My daughter was upstairs, and my son-in-law had gone out. I was alone with the dim light above the stove, the hum of the refrigerator, and the memories that spilled from the box. I opened one of the envelopes and found a letter my husband wrote in the early days of our marriage. His words were simple, but one line struck me. "Keep this box close, because one day it will protect you when I no longer can." I had read that line before, but never had it felt so urgent, so alive. I traced my fingers over each item, remembering the stories attached. The brooch from my grandmother had been pinned to my coat the day I first took the bus to my factory job. The locket held our wedding photograph, edges curled with time. There were receipts tucked away from the early years, proof of tiny purchases we made when we had so little but managed to build a life anyway. These were not treasures by my son-in-law's measure, but they were the only map of my life I still carried. As I sat there, I realized the cruel irony. Everything I valued had been dismissed as garbage, yet here I was, clinging to one rescued box, as though it contained the whole of me. Perhaps in a way it did. I felt anger rise in me, but beneath it was something steadier, a refusal to be erased. I decided I would not let this act go unanswered. I might not confront them immediately, but I would not sit quietly while the story of my life was treated as worthless. I closed the box, ran my hand across its rough lid, and whispered to myself that it was not junk. I did not yet know just how true those words would turn out to be. The next morning I sat at the kitchen table with my tea growing cold, trying to gather the courage to ask directly what had been taken. My daughter walked in with her phone in hand, scrolling with one finger while answering my questions half-heartedly. I asked her if she knew what happened to the cedar chest, the one that sat under the front window for years. She didn't even look up. "Oh, that heavy thing? He took it out first. It was falling apart. You don't need it anymore." Her words cut through me sharper than I expected. I pushed a little harder, asking about the albums, the binders of recipes, the boxes that had sat in the closet. She shrugged, saying, "Mom, you never even open those things. It's better this way. Now you can focus on recovery." The way she said it, like it was an act of kindness, made it sting all the more. I bit down the urge to argue, because I could feel my son-in-law's presence lingering even when he wasn't in the room. He always had a way of making his opinions feel final, even when they weren't. After she left for work, I wandered into the living room again. The sunlight came through the blinds, falling across bare spaces where furniture used to sit. It wasn't just the absence of objects that unsettled me, but the emptiness of history. I remembered the first time I placed my husband's medals on that shelf. He had stood behind me, quiet, watching as I arranged them in a row. He never bragged about his service, but I knew he felt proud when he saw them there. Now the shelf itself was gone, as if those years had been erased with a single decision. Later that day, my son-in-law returned, carrying groceries in one arm and speaking loudly about how much better the house looked. He explained that he had rented a small dumpster to make the cleanup easier. He seemed proud of himself, calling it a real project. I nodded, pretending not to notice the ache that spread across my chest, one that had nothing to do with stitches or healing. He put the groceries down and said, "You'll see, this place feels fresh now. No one wants to live surrounded by clutter." I wanted to tell him those things weren't clutter. They were anchors, each one holding a piece of me steady. But the words didn't leave my lips. Instead, I excused myself and walked out to the porch. Across the street, I saw Mrs. Turner again. She gave me a small nod, as if to say she understood. Her quiet presence reminded me that not everyone thought of memories as waste. That evening I sat with the jewelry box again. I studied every piece, as if I had never seen them before. The locket, the brooch, the envelopes, they felt heavier, more alive, because they were the only survivors. I remembered my husband telling me that one day this box would protect me. At the time I thought it was a sentimental phrase, something meant to comfort me. Now I wondered if he had sensed how easily people could discard the past when they no longer found it convenient. The next day, I tried once more to reach my daughter, hoping she might see what I was losing. I asked if she remembered playing with the jewelry box when she was little, how she used to sit on the floor pulling out the trinkets and pretending to be a queen. She smiled faintly, but then shook her head. That was a long time ago, Mom. We don't need to hold on to every little thing. Her words weren't cruel, but they were dismissive. It was the dismissal that hurt most, the suggestion that what mattered to me no longer deserved space in her world. I stayed quiet after that, but inside I was boiling with questions. How long had they been planning this cleanup? Did they talk about it while I was in the hospital? Did they wait until I was too weak to argue back? The thought twisted in my chest, leaving me both angry and hollow. I knew one thing clearly. My daughter might have gone along with it, but the driving hand behind this was her husband. He always carried himself with a certainty that made others hesitate to challenge him. The following afternoon, I stepped outside and walked slowly to the side of the house where the trash bins stood. They were already emptied, nothing left but the smell of dust and plastic. My hands trembled as I held onto the edge of the bin, imagining all the moments that had been carried away in the truck. Photos, letters, stitched quilts, toys my children once held. To the workers, it was just another load. To me, it was decades of life. Mrs. Turner noticed me standing there and came over. She didn't say much, only asked if I was all right. I told her about the chest, about the albums, about the medals that were gone. She listened, not rushing me, not telling me to move on. She simply nodded, her eyes soft, and finally said, "Sometimes people don't understand until it's too late. But you still have this." She gestured to the jewelry box I had carried outside with me, clutched against my chest. That night, I sat with the box once more and began reading through the letters tied with string. My husband's words filled the silence of the room. He wrote about long nights overseas, about missing home, about dreaming of the day he would return to sit in our kitchen again. I felt his presence stronger than I had in years, as though the words were not just ink but living proof that he had been here, that he mattered, that we mattered. I realized then why I felt so unsettled. It wasn't only about losing objects. It was about the erasure of proof that our lives carried weight. Without those items, my daughter and her husband could reshape the story however they wanted, making it smaller, simpler, easier to dismiss. But this box in my hands reminded me that the truth was still here, waiting to be seen. As I closed the lid that night, I whispered again to myself that it wasn't junk. And though I didn't know what I would do next, I knew I couldn't let their careless act be the final word. Somewhere inside me, a decision was taking root. The following week, I tried to settle back into a routine, though the silence inside the house made it hard. Recovery from surgery was supposed to mean rest, but I found myself pacing slowly from room to room, searching for what was no longer there. Every time I reached for a book, a box, or a drawer that used to hold something meaningful, I was reminded of what had been taken. It felt like a second kind of operation, one that cut away not flesh but history. One morning, as I shuffled toward the front porch for air, I noticed the city truck down the street. Workers lifted bags and broken furniture into the back, without a second glance. I wondered if pieces of my life were already buried under piles at the landfill, crushed and unrecognizable. The thought made me grip the railing tighter. It was not just about things, but about proof that I had lived, worked, and sacrificed. Watching them work, I realized how fast a life could be erased if left in the wrong hands. Later that afternoon, I heard footsteps outside and found Mrs. Turner waiting with a small smile. She said she had something for me and held out a folded piece of paper. It was a flyer from the local community center about an antiques appraisal event scheduled for the weekend. "Maybe you could bring that box," she suggested softly. I hesitated, feeling almost embarrassed at the idea. To me, the box held memories, not wealth. Still, her encouragement made me consider it. That night, I sat again with the jewelry box on the kitchen table. I opened it carefully, studying each item as though weighing whether it deserved attention from strangers. My husband's medals had been lost with the chest, but Here I still had the brooch, the locket, and the bundle of letters. I placed them back in order, hearing my daughter's voice in my head calling them trinkets. The words stung, but I reminded myself that these were not scraps. They were markers of survival. When Saturday came, I wrapped the box in a scarf and asked Mrs. Turner if she would walk with me. She agreed immediately. We moved slowly together toward the community center, my steps cautious but determined. Inside, the room buzzed with people carrying bags, small tables, and odd-shaped packages. Some carried dusty paintings, others held dishes or lamps. The air smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish, a mixture of age and curiosity. We sat in a short line until it was my turn. The appraiser, a middle-aged man with wire glasses, greeted me politely. I placed the jewelry box on the table and opened it. He leaned closer, his expression shifting from routine interest to careful concentration. He picked up the brooch first, turning it under the light. Then the locket, noting the detail around the edges. He studied the envelopes, examining the handwriting and the stamps. He asked where I had found them, and I explained that they had been mine for years, tucked away until recently. He nodded and began speaking in measured tones, explaining that the brooch was a rare design from the early 20th century, the locket crafted in a style not often preserved in such condition, and the letters historically valuable due to the dates and military references. He asked if I realized what I had been holding. I shook my head, barely able to respond. He leaned back and gave me a number. My chest tightened as I tried to process his words. The collection, he said, could be valued around $720,000 if sold to the right buyer or preserved in a trust. My mouth went dry. I had walked in expecting nothing more than sentimental validation, and instead I was staring at a figure larger than anything I had ever earned in a lifetime of work. Mrs. Turner placed a steady hand on my arm as if she knew I might faint from shock. The appraiser repeated the number slowly, perhaps worried I had not heard him correctly. I nodded but could not speak. My husband's words about the box protecting me now rang louder than ever. For years I had kept it without thinking much of its worth, and now I discovered it carried more value than my daughter or son-in-law could imagine. We left the community center quietly, the box still wrapped in its scarf. As we walked back, I found myself torn between relief and anger. Relief that the box had been saved, anger that so much else had been lost without care. I pictured my son-in-law tossing items into the dumpster with pride, unaware that he was throwing away fortunes, both emotional and material. I wondered if I should tell them about the appraisal, or if silence might be the sharper answer. That evening, my daughter came by to check on me. She asked how I was feeling, her tone light but distracted, her eyes fixed on her phone. I looked at her and thought of the number that still rang in my head. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to see her face when she realized what her husband had discarded. But instead, I stayed quiet. I decided in that moment that the knowledge was mine alone. After she left, I sat with the box once more. This time, I did not see it as fragile. I saw it as powerful, a reminder that even when others tried to erase me, something of me remained. I traced the edges of the brooch and the locket and thought of the years I had spent working long shifts, cooking, cleaning, saving, and raising children. Every sacrifice I made was still here in some form, packed into the corners of that box. I began to consider what this meant for the future. The money itself was staggering, but it was not about wealth. It was about choice. My daughter and her husband had already shown me how little they valued what I cared for. If I left the inheritance to them, they would likely sell it quickly, pocket the money, and forget the meaning behind it. I could not let that happen. As I closed the lid, I looked out the window toward Mrs. Turner's home. A thought surfaced, still faint, that the person who had shown me more respect than my own family might deserve to carry this legacy instead. The idea settled in me like a seed, waiting for its time to grow. The night after the appraisal, I could hardly sleep. The number echoed in my head, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. $720,000. I had lived long enough to know that money could solve problems but could also create new ones. I kept asking myself what I would do with that knowledge. It felt both like a gift and a burden. The following morning, I tried to act normal when my daughter visited. She set a bag of groceries on the counter and began chatting about errands, never once asking me how I felt about the changes in the house. I studied her face, wondering if she had any idea what her husband had thrown away. For a moment I thought about telling her, but I held back. The words stayed stuck in my throat, not because I couldn't say them, but because I didn't trust what she would do with them. After she left, I walked through the house again. The spaces where my belongings once sat seemed even larger now, like holes in the walls that could not be patched. I remembered the nights I stayed up sewing at the old machine, the evenings I sat with my children on the couch flipping through albums, the mornings I polished the medals before setting them back on the shelf. These were not just objects. They were markers of effort and memory. Now they were gone, not because of time, but because of carelessness. That afternoon, I invited Mrs. Turner over for tea. I wanted to thank her properly for saving the jewelry box. We sat at the kitchen table, the box between us, and I told her what the appraiser had said. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head slowly. They had no idea what they were throwing out, she whispered. I nodded, feeling both vindicated and heartbroken. I admitted that my daughter and son-in-law had dismissed everything as clutter. Mrs. Turner listened quietly, not interrupting, not offering excuses for them. She just let me speak until I had said everything I needed. Later that evening, I pulled out one of my husband's letters from the box and read it again. He had written during a long stretch overseas, describing his fears and his hope of coming home. Toward the end, he had added a note about the box itself. If you keep this safe, it will remind you one day that nothing we built together was wasted. I read that line over and over until the words blurred. He had trusted me to keep it safe, and somehow, even with everything else gone, I had. The next few days, I carried the box from room to room like a companion. I didn't tell my daughter about the appraisal, though I sensed she knew something was on my mind. One afternoon, she asked directly what I kept looking at in that box. I told her it was just old keepsakes. She shrugged and replied, "As long as it doesn't weigh you down, Mom." Her tone was casual, but I felt the distance between us more than ever. That evening, I sat alone in the living room and began to wonder what legacy really meant. I had worked for years, saved every penny I could, and given most of it to my children when they needed it. When my daughter bought her first car, I gave her the down payment. When my son-in-law lost his job briefly, I helped them cover bills. I never asked for repayment. I assumed that one day, respect and care would come in return. Now, watching how easily they dismissed my life's belongings, I realized I had been wrong. The thought grew stronger each day. What if I left the value of this box to someone else? Not for spite, but because respect mattered more than blood when blood had forgotten loyalty. Mrs. Turner had shown more concern in one small act than my own family had in weeks. That single choice to rescue the box had preserved everything. If she had not stepped in, the appraisal would have been meaningless because the box would already be gone. One evening, she came by with a pie she had baked, insisting I take the bigger half. We sat on the porch, watching the street grow quiet as the sun lowered. She told me about her own children, how distance had grown between them over the years. She did not speak badly of them, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. I realized then that we were both carrying similar weights, both trying to accept that the people we raised were no longer the ones we remembered. After she left, I thought more about the will I had drawn up years ago. At the time, I had divided everything between my daughter and my son, thinking it was the fair thing to do. Now, fairness felt different. Fairness was not only about splitting property. It was about recognizing who truly valued what was left. If I left the box and its contents to my daughter, I knew it would be sold quickly, without thought or respect. But if I left it to Mrs. Turner, she would treat it as it deserved, not as a pile of outdated trinkets. The idea stayed with me, growing firmer each day. I knew it would shock my daughter, maybe even anger her, but I also knew I had to decide for myself. I could not erase the pain of what had already been discarded, but I could choose what happened next. I could ensure that the box and everything it represented would not be lost again. That night, as I locked the jewelry box and placed it back on the table, I whispered the same words I had said before. This is not junk. And now I knew exactly what I would do with it. The morning after I made my decision about the box, my daughter stopped by unannounced. She walked in without knocking, something she had always done, but now it felt more like an intrusion than a habit. She looked around the house, scanning the bare shelves, and asked if I was finally getting used to the new arrangement. I forced a smile and said I was adjusting. She nodded, satisfied, and poured herself a cup of coffee without asking. As she sat across from me at the kitchen table, I noticed the distance in her eyes. She spoke about work, her children, errands, but never asked about my recovery, my feelings, or how I was managing. It struck me then that the divide between us had grown so wide that ordinary conversation felt like small talk between strangers. When she finally asked what I had been doing with myself during the day, I mentioned the jewelry box. Her eyes flickered with recognition, but not with warmth. "Oh, that thing. You've kept it out?" she said, almost amused. I nodded and told her I had been going through the letters. She shrugged and said, "I suppose if it keeps you busy." The dismissiveness in her tone reminded me of how she used to talk to her children when they begged for one more television show before bed. I wanted to shake her, to remind her that the box contained pieces of her own history too, but I stayed quiet. Later that day, my son-in-law came over to fix a loose railing on the porch. He worked quickly, hammering in new nails, and when he finished, he came inside for a drink of water. He spotted the box on the counter and frowned. "You're still holding on to that old thing?" he asked, his voice edged with irritation. "We got rid of everything else." That was the point. I told him it mattered to me. He shook his head and muttered, "Sometimes you can't let go of the past. It keeps people from moving forward." His words were spoken like advice, but I heard the judgment underneath. To him, I was weak for wanting to keep memories alive. He didn't realize that his view of strength was only about control, never about care. That night, I thought back to when my daughter was young. She had once asked to borrow that same jewelry box to play pretend with her friends. She had worn the brooch as if it were a crown and tucked her toys into the compartments. She laughed and called it her treasure chest. I remembered sitting in the corner, watching her with pride. It was painful now to realize that she had forgotten that joy and replaced it with indifference. The following evening, I overheard my daughter and her husband talking on the porch while they thought I was asleep. He told her he was glad he had cleared out the house and that soon it might be time to look into assisted living options for me. My daughter hesitated, but didn't disagree. She said something about how it would be easier for everyone. Their voices cut through me more than any scar. To them, I was already an afterthought, a burden to be managed. I lay awake in bed that night staring at the ceiling, my hands folded over the jewelry box resting beside me. I realized then that telling them about the appraisal would not bridge the gap between us. If anything, it would only make them see the box as money, not as history. They would never see what I saw when I looked at it. They would never hear my husband's words in those letters, never feel the weight of survival in the brooch or the locket. To them, it was profit waiting to be cashed. Over the next few days, I withdrew more from their visits. When my daughter came by, I kept the conversations brief. When my son-in-law spoke about changes he wanted to make in the house, I let his words wash over me without response. Inside, though, I was planning. I began to picture the lawyer's office, the pen in my hand, the paper, where I could write down exactly what would happen to the box when I was gone. One afternoon, Mrs. Turner came over with a basket of rolls she had baked. We sat together at the table, and I told her about overhearing my daughter and son-in-law. She shook her head and said, "People forget where they came from sometimes. But you don't have to let them decide for you." Her words gave me strength. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was not alone in my thoughts. That night, I opened the box again and spread the letters across the table. I read them one by one, as if gathering courage from the ink. Each letter was proof that my life had been built on work, love, and persistence. I thought of how my husband had believed in me, even when money was scarce and times were hard. He had trusted me to keep going, and now I realized it was my turn to trust myself to make the right choice about the future. By the end of the week, I had made up my mind. The box would not go to my daughter or her husband. They had lost that right when they decided my life was clutter. Instead, I would ensure it went to someone who understood its worth. The idea of leaving it to Mrs. Turner no longer felt like a faint thought but a decision. She had shown me kindness without asking for anything in return. That meant more to me than blood ties ever could. I closed the box, pressed my hand against the lid, and felt a sense of calm settle over me. For the first time since my surgery, I felt like I was standing on steady ground again. The following week my daughter came by again, this time with her husband. From the moment they stepped into the kitchen, I sensed a different energy. He carried himself like a man preparing for an argument, his shoulders stiff and his tone louder than necessary. My daughter trailed behind him, silent but uneasy, as though she knew what was coming but had chosen to stay out of it. He glanced at the jewelry box on the table, the same place it had been for days, and let out a sharp sigh. "We talked about this," he said firmly. "That thing is nothing but a reminder of the past. It's time you stop clinging to it." I stayed calm, even though my pulse quickened. I told him it was not his decision to make, that the box belonged to me and always had. He smirked, the kind of smile that carried no humor, and said, "You can't take it with you when you're gone. Why not sell it and put the money to use now?" My daughter shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. I asked him what he thought I should do with the money if I sold it. He shrugged and said, "You could give it to your children. Or make things easier for us while we look after you." His words hung heavy in the air. There was no concern in them, only expectation. He wasn't asking out of care. He was demanding, cloaked as suggestion. I looked at my daughter then, searching for any sign of disagreement, but she lowered her gaze. Her silence told me everything. She had chosen to stand behind him, even if it meant standing against me. For the first time, I felt a sharp clarity. They didn't see me as a mother anymore. They saw me as an account waiting to be opened. Later that evening, after they left, I sat at the table with the box in front of me. My hands rested on the lid, steady this time, not trembling as before. I realized that if I didn't take action soon, they might try to take control of it themselves. I knew the laws well enough to understand that if they pushed, they could pressure me into decisions I didn't want to make. I decided then to protect the box and everything it represented before they had the chance. The next morning, I made an appointment with my lawyer. Walking into his office felt both strange and empowering. I had not been there in years, not since I wrote the first will that divided everything equally between my children. He greeted me kindly, asked how my recovery was going, and then waited as I explained what I wanted to change. I told him plainly that the jewelry box and its contents were not to go to my daughter or her husband. I asked that it be left to Mrs. Turner, my neighbor, the one person who had shown me true respect. The lawyer raised his eyebrows slightly, surprised, but he didn't question me. Instead, he nodded and began drafting the changes. As I signed my name, I felt something loosen inside me, as if a weight I had carried for weeks had finally been set down. When I returned home that afternoon, I placed the newly signed papers in a folder and tucked them away in my desk. I kept the jewelry box in its usual place on the table. For me, nothing outwardly had changed, but inside, everything had. I knew that whatever they tried, my decision was now written and secure. The following day my daughter called, her tone sharper than usual. She asked if I had thought more about what her husband had said. I told her I had. She seemed relieved until I added, "I've made arrangements, but not in the way you think." She fell quiet, and after a long pause, she said she hoped I wasn't making a mistake. I could hear her husband's voice faintly in the background, muttering something I couldn't make out. I hung up feeling stronger than I had in months. They thought I was still fragile, still dependent on them, but the truth was the opposite. I had taken control, in the only way that mattered. That evening Mrs. Turner brought over soup, and we sat together again on the porch. I told her, without details, that I had taken steps to ensure the box would be safe. She smiled gently and said, "Then you've done the right thing." We sat quietly for a while, the cool air settling around us, and I felt a rare peace. For the first time since my surgery, I knew I had taken back my voice. Inside, the jewelry box sat where it always had, but it no longer felt like a target. It felt like a shield, And I knew, no matter what they tried, I had already chosen where its story would go next. A few days later, my daughter invited me to dinner at her house. She said she wanted to spend time together, but I knew from the edge in her voice that it was not simply about family. I agreed anyway, sensing it might be better to face whatever was coming rather than wait for it to arrive on its own terms. When I walked in, the table was set neatly, the food already placed in serving bowls. My grandchildren ran past me, their laughter filling the air, and for a brief moment I wished things could be simple again. But as soon as I saw my son-in-law sitting at the head of the table, arms folded, eyes fixed on me, I knew why I had really been asked to come. We ate quietly at first. My daughter tried to make small talk about school events, work, and plans for the summer. The children interrupted here and there, but their voices faded whenever my son-in-law spoke. He controlled the rhythm of the evening, every glance reminding me of what he had already said about letting go of the past. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down and leaned forward. "We should talk about the future," he said, his tone direct. "You're still holding on to that box, and I don't understand why. It's just sitting there collecting dust. You should be thinking about how it can help your family now." I felt my daughter stiffen beside him, but she stayed silent. I looked at both of them and said I had already made decisions about my things, and they did not need to worry. My son-in-law pressed harder. "Decisions can change," he replied. "You might think you've done what's best, but we know what's practical." The word practical landed like a slap. To him, my memories were impractical, my choices unnecessary. I asked him calmly what he thought was so practical about throwing away medals, photographs, and albums. His face darkened, and he muttered something about clutter, saying no one cared about old papers. My daughter tried to interrupt, but he held up his hand, silencing her. The tension grew heavy. I told him the box was mine to keep, and that it carried more than he could possibly understand. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned closer. "So, what's in it that's so important? Why hide it from your own family?" My daughter's gaze flickered between us, uneasy, as though she knew she should step in but chose not to. I took a breath and said it wasn't about hiding anything. It was about respecting what mattered to me. He smirked, shaking his head, and said, "Respect goes both ways. If you respected us, you'd realize we're the ones who will be left to handle everything when you're gone." That was the moment I understood fully that there was no misunderstanding between us. He was not confused. He was not trying to help. He believed my belongings, my choices, and even my life story were his to manage. My daughter's silence only confirmed it. She had allowed him to decide for both of them. I left the table quietly after that, saying I was tired. My daughter walked me to the door, avoiding my eyes. She whispered that he only wanted what was best. I stopped, turned to her, and said softly, "What's best for who?" She didn't answer. When I got home that night, I sat at the table with the jewelry box again. I felt anger rising, but beneath it was a sharp clarity. For weeks I had questioned whether I was being too harsh in cutting them out of my plans. That dinner gave me the answer. They had shown me who they were, and I had finally listened. The next morning, I opened the folder where the newel sat. I read over the words slowly, letting each sentence settle. The box and its contents would go to Mrs. Turner. Nothing about that felt wrong. In fact, it felt like the first time I had chosen something for myself in years without guilt. Later in the day, my daughter called again. She asked if I was upset about the dinner. I told her the truth, that I was not upset but resolved. She paused, then asked, "What does that mean?" I answered simply, "It means I know exactly what I'm doing now." She didn't press further, but I could hear the unease in her silence. That evening, Mrs. Turner stopped by, and we shared tea on the porch. I told her about the dinner, about the way he spoke as if my life were already signed over to him. She shook her head and said, "People show their true selves when they think they have the upper hand." Her words stayed with me long after she left. For the first time in a long while, I no longer felt like the weaker one. I felt like the person holding the real choice, and I knew exactly how to use it. The day after that dinner, I noticed a change in the way my daughter spoke to me. Her calls were shorter, and when she did stop by, she seemed distracted, glancing around the house as though checking what remained. My son-in-law didn't come with her that week, but I could feel his presence in her clipped words and her nervous pauses. It was as if he had sent her to gather information without saying it outright. She asked about my health, though her tone lacked warmth. Then she asked about the jewelry box. Her question seemed casual on the surface, but I could tell it was rehearsed. "Do you still keep that old thing out?" she said lightly. I told her I did. Her eyes shifted, and she nodded too quickly. She didn't press further, but I could sense she wanted to. That evening I locked the box in my bedroom drawer instead of leaving it on the table. For weeks it had been a comfort to keep it near me, but now I realized leaving it in plain sight was an invitation for trouble. My trust in them was already broken, and something told me the next step would not be polite suggestions but actions. 2 days later, while resting in the living room, I heard the front door open. My daughter had a key, which had never bothered me before. This time, she wasn't alone. My son-in-law stepped in behind her carrying a large plastic bin. I sat up quickly, my chest tightening. He said they were here to help me organize. I told them firmly, I didn't ask for help. My daughter insisted it would make things easier for me, that I needed less clutter in the house. I knew exactly what she meant by clutter. He began walking toward the hallway as though he owned the place. My voice sharpened when I told him to stop. He turned, surprised by the strength in my tone, but not enough to back down. The three of us stood there in silence for a moment. My daughter looked from him to me, torn but unwilling to take my side. I realized then she would not stand against him, no matter how far he went. The man I once welcomed as family now stood in my home, acting as though I was the guest. I forced them both to leave. My daughter looked embarrassed as she pulled him toward the door, whispering that it wasn't worth it. Before leaving, he muttered that I was being stubborn, that one day I would thank him for forcing me to face reality. The slam of the door echoed through the empty hallway. After they left, I went straight to the bedroom and checked the drawer. The box was still there, untouched. I held it against me as I sat on the bed, steadying my breathing. It wasn't just about objects anymore. It was about my right to decide what mattered in my own life. The next morning I called my lawyer again. I asked him what protections I had if someone tried to take my belongings without my permission. He explained that as long as I was of sound mind, my choices were final. He also suggested placing the box in a safe deposit box at the bank if I feared it being taken. The idea settled in my thoughts. It felt like the right next step. That afternoon, Mrs. Turner stopped by to bring me groceries. I told her what had happened, how they had come into the house without asking and tried to take more. She shook her head in disbelief. "That isn't help," she said. "That's control." Her words reflected exactly what I had been feeling. She offered to drive me to the bank if I decided to move the box. I promised I would think about it. The following days were tense. My daughter called less, but when she did, she always asked how I was spending my time. The questions were too pointed to be casual. I gave vague answers, never mentioning the lawyer or the appraisal. I could tell she was frustrated. Each silence between us grew longer. One evening, after hanging up the phone, I walked back to the bedroom and opened the drawer again. I studied the box, its scratched wood, the way the clasp stuck slightly on one side. I realized then that its strength wasn't only in its contents. Its strength was in the fact that I still had the power to protect it. Moving it to the bank would not erase its meaning. It would safeguard it from hands that didn't deserve to touch it. That night, I slept with the box beside me for what I knew would be the last time. The next morning, I would take it to the bank with Mrs. Turner. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not because the battle was over, but because I had finally chosen how to fight it. The next morning, Mrs. Turner drove me to the bank. The jewelry box rested on my lap the whole ride, wrapped in the same scarf I had used at the appraisal. I held it firmly, not because I feared it might fall, but because it felt like I was carrying the last piece of my voice. We didn't speak much on the drive. Sometimes silence says more than words. At the bank, I explained what I needed. The clerk guided us through the process of renting a safe deposit box. When the metal drawer slid open, I placed the jewelry box inside. My hands lingered for a moment on the lid before I pulled them back. Closing that drawer was harder than I expected, but as the clerk turned the key, I felt a weight lift from me. For the first time, I knew it could not be taken from me in the middle of the night, nor dismissed as clutter by those who didn't value it. On the way home, Mrs. Turner asked if I felt better. I told her I did, though in truth it was a complicated feeling. I was relieved, but also sad that it had come to this. A mother should not have to hide her history from her own daughter. Still, I reminded myself that I had done the right thing. When I returned home, the house felt different. Empty still, but less vulnerable. I made tea and sat at the table, this time without the jewelry box beside me. At first I missed the comfort of seeing it there, but gradually I realized the comfort had been replaced by certainty. It was safe, and so was I. 2 days later, my daughter arrived with her husband. I could tell from the way he walked in that he was ready for another attempt. He asked straight away about the jewelry box. His eyes darted toward the table where it used to sit. I told him it was no longer in the house. His expression hardened. He demanded to know where it was. I answered simply, safe. My daughter looked at me, worried, and asked what I meant. I repeated the word, safe. I didn't owe them any more explanation. The silence that followed was heavy. He realized then that I had acted without their knowledge, that control had slipped out of his hands. He accused me of being influenced by outsiders. He even suggested Mrs. Turner was filling my head with ideas. I corrected him quickly. This decision was mine alone, and no one had the power to change it. My daughter tried to calm him, but the damage was done. He had shown me the depth of his entitlement, and she had shown me once again that she would not stand against him. That evening, after they stormed out, I sat in the living room replaying every word. Instead of fear, I felt a kind of calm strength. They finally knew I wasn't going to bend. They finally understood I had taken measures they could not undo. The following morning my daughter called, her voice softer this time. She said she didn't want things to become hostile between us. She asked if I could at least tell her what was in the box. I paused before answering. I told her it contained letters, keepsakes, and some valuables, but that the details didn't matter. What mattered was that it belonged to me, and that I had every right to decide where it would go. She sighed, sounding defeated, and said she wished I would trust her more. I wanted to laugh at the irony, but instead I said, trust is earned. And lately, you haven't tried to earn it. That conversation marked a shift. They didn't stop trying to push, but they understood the lines were drawn. I was no longer the quiet mother who nodded along to keep peace. I had boundaries, and I had the strength to enforce them. Over the next week, I thought often about what the appraiser had told me, about the number that still rang in my head. $720,000. It wasn't just money. It was independence. It was protection against the people who saw me as weak. And most of all, it was proof that the life I had built had value that no one could erase. I visited the bank again a few days later, just to reassure myself. The clerk led me to the same room, slid open the drawer, and there it was, unchanged. I touched the lid gently, whispered to myself that I had done the right thing, and closed it again. On the walk back, I realized I no longer felt like I was hiding. I felt like I was preparing. When I returned home, Mrs. Turner was waiting on the porch. She asked how it felt to see the box again. I told her it felt like seeing an old friend, steady and patient. She smiled and said, "That's how you know you've done right by it." We sat for a while, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But I knew the story wasn't over. My daughter and her husband had made it clear they would not let go easily. They might not know exactly what was in the box, but they knew it mattered. And to people like them, anything that mattered became something to control. I had to be ready. The days after the confrontation at the bank felt strangely quiet. My daughter stopped calling for a while, and when she finally did, her voice carried a strained politeness. She asked about my health and the weather before circling back to the box. This time she wasn't sharp or defensive. She was cautious, almost rehearsed. I knew what she wanted, but I let her talk. Eventually she asked, "Mom, why don't you just tell me what's in it?" We're your family. We should know. I let the silence stretch before answering. Then I told her plainly, you don't need to know. You only need to trust that I've made my decision. Her sigh on the other end of the line told me she understood exactly what that meant, even if she didn't want to admit it. A few days later, she and her husband showed up together, unannounced as usual. They walked in with expressions that told me this was not a casual visit. My son-in-law wasted no time. We need to talk about that box, he said. My daughter stood next to him, nodding but looking down. I sat at the table, folded my hands, and told them both to sit. He started with flattery, talking about how much they cared for me, how much they wanted to make sure I was comfortable. Then he shifted, saying they couldn't understand why I was being so secretive. I reminded him that it was mine, and that I had the right to decide what happened to it. His voice grew sharper. You're making a mistake. You're being influenced. That was the moment I decided to end the guessing. I leaned forward and told them I had the box appraised. My daughter's head snapped up. My son-in-law froze. Their silence was louder than any words they could have spoken. I told them the number slowly, letting it settle between us. $720,000. My daughter's mouth fell open. His jaw clenched. I watched the emotions cross their faces. Shock first, then greed, then anger. He was the first to speak. You mean to tell me you've been sitting on something worth nearly $1 million and you planned to just let it rot away?
Iyan svarat calmly, no.
I planned to let it go to someone who valued it. My daughter's voice cracked when she finally spoke. Mom, you can't be serious. You'd leave that to a stranger? I corrected her gently. A stranger who showed me more respect in one moment than you both have in years. Her face flushed red. She started to protest, but I stopped her with a raised hand. I explained everything then. How Mrs. Turner had saved the box from the trash. How I had taken it to the appraiser. How I had already gone to the lawyer. Every word seemed to strip another layer of power from them. My son-in-law's anger turned to cold calculation. He muttered that I was being manipulated. My daughter begged me to reconsider. But for once, I did not bend. I told them the truth, that the value of the box wasn't just in money, but in history. In the medals, the letters, the pieces of my life they had dismissed as junk. I reminded them of the albums, the furniture, the belongings they had thrown out while I was recovering from surgery. You already showed me what my life means to you, I said. Now I'm showing you what your actions mean to me. The room went quiet. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't apologize. My son-in-law stood abruptly and said they were leaving. At the door, he turned and spat out, "You'll regret this." I looked him in the eye and answered, "No, I regret trusting you." Then I closed the door behind them. After they left, I sat alone in the silence. I should have felt broken, but instead I felt steady. For the first time in years, I had stood fully in my own truth without wavering. The box was safe. The decision was final. They could rage all they wanted, but they no longer had control. That evening I wrote in my journal. I wrote about the medals, the letters, the brooch, the locket. I wrote about the long nights my husband and I had worked to keep the house. I wrote about the sacrifices I had made for my children. And then I wrote about the moment I realized that blood ties alone did not guarantee respect. By the time I set the pen down, I knew the story was no longer just about a box. It was about reclaiming the right to decide my own worth. The morning after they stormed out, I sat quietly at the table with a cup of tea, thinking about everything that had happened. My house was still stripped of much of what once filled it, but I no longer felt like the one left behind. The box was safe, the decision was written into law, and my children finally knew they could no longer control my choices. For the first time since my surgery, I felt like I was breathing freely again. Over the next week, my daughter called twice, each time with a different tone. The first call was emotional, her voice breaking as she said she didn't understand why I would choose a neighbor over family. The second call was colder, more calculated, asking if I was sure about the legal papers. Both conversations ended the same way, with me saying I was certain. One afternoon, Mrs. Turner came by with a basket of apples from the market. We sat on the porch, and I told her about the will. She was shocked, insisting she didn't expect anything like that. She said she had only wanted to help when she pulled the box from the pile. I smiled and told her that was exactly why she deserved it. She valued it without knowing its worth, which was more than I could say for my own family. That evening, I walked through each room of my home. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway where my children once ran. I touched the walls, remembering the nights of laughter, the mornings of worry, and the years of quiet work that had built everything around me. Most of it had been tossed aside by others, but the memories stayed with me. I realized then that I didn't need to fight for the objects anymore. I had already fought for the meaning, and I had won. A week later, my lawyer called to confirm that the updated will had been filed securely. Hearing that gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. I knew now that nothing my daughter or her husband did could undo it. The box would go where I wanted it to go, and the story of my life would not be erased. My daughter showed up the following weekend. She came alone this time, without her husband. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. She sat at the kitchen table just like old times, and for the first few minutes we sat in silence. Finally, she asked if there was any way to change my mind. I told her gently, but firmly, that there wasn't. She began to cry, saying she had only wanted to make things easier, that she never meant to hurt me. I listened, but inside I knew her actions had spoken louder than her words. I told her that respect is not measured by apologies made after the fact, but by choices made in the moment. She nodded, tears running down her face, and for once, she didn't argue. After she left, I felt a heaviness lift. I had said everything that needed to be said. Whether she understood or not was no longer my burden. I had protected what mattered most, and I had done it on my own terms. In the days that followed, I found myself spending more time with Mrs. Turner. We shared meals, traded stories, and laughed in ways I hadn't in years. She reminded me that life wasn't over just because parts of it had been taken from me. There was still time to create new memories, to build new bonds. One evening, as the sun set, I walked to the bank again. The clerk opened the drawer, and I lifted the box out for a moment. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Just holding it reminded me that I had kept my promise to myself and to my husband. Nothing had been wasted. I whispered a quiet thank you and placed it back inside. When I left the bank, I didn't feel like I was walking away from the past. I felt like I was walking into the future with certainty. I had taken back my voice, and I had left a clear mark of who I was and what I valued. That night, I wrote one final entry in my journal. I wrote that the jewelry box was no longer just mine. It belonged to the future, carried by someone who had shown kindness when no one else would. I ended with a line that summed up everything I had learned. Family is not only about blood, it is about respect, and sometimes a stranger can show more family than those closest to you. As I closed the journal, I felt peace. The story of the box was complete, and so was mine. When I look back on everything that happened, I realized this was never just about a jewelry box. It was about dignity, about choosing not to be erased in my own home, and about standing firm when those closest to me tried to silence me. The box was worth money, yes, but more than that, it was worth history, sacrifice, and love. Protecting it reminded me that I still had a voice, even when others wanted to speak for me. And maybe that's the heart of it. No one else can decide what our lives mean. Not our children, not their spouses, not even time itself. We decide. That power doesn't disappear with age. It only grows stronger when we dare to claim it. But I know my story is not the only one. Families fight not just over objects, but over homes, legacies, and the meaning of belonging. Sometimes the hardest betrayal comes not from strangers, but from the people we thought we could trust most. If you've stayed with me this far, you'll want to hear what happened when an innocent comment from a 5-year-old revealed a secret plan to sell everything I had worked for. Watch that next, it will leave you stunned.